Dr. Gregory Jantz is a best-selling author of over 45 books and the founder of the Center A Place of Hope, voted a top 10 center for depression treatment in the U.S. As the pioneer of whole-person care, Dr. Jantz is known as the messenger of hope. Now the nation's expert on anxiety, depression, substance abuse, relationships, trauma, and PTSD, here is Dr. Gregory Jantz.
Hi, it's Dr. Jantz. Here we are. It is a time of intensity. And by intensity, what I mean is we are seeing, and this is probably my most difficult topic ever to talk about. I'm talking about today the potential of suicide. I say potential because right now we're finding in that age range, and it's usually given, I just pulled the stats up, 12 to 17-year-olds, it's difficult to even communicate this. And the other range I give is 15 to 19. So let's say 12 years old to 19, critical age range. Of that, right now, 1 out of 5 in that age group, both male and female, any gender, has considered suicide. Of the 1 in 5 in that age range, we are at the place where we're seeing about 1 in 6. So 1 out of every 6 individuals, 12 to 19, have actually made a plan, researched, put together options for how they would take their life. The topic of suicide today is our topic. And it's one that we all know somebody. We all know, if it's not in our immediate family, we all know somebody that is in our circle of friends and acquaintance that has committed suicide. Not a topic that I ever thought I would ever be talking about, let alone we did a book here not long ago, So Much to Live For. The whole idea of doing a book on suicide or suicide prevention honestly was not on my radar. It wasn't an area that I had given full thought to before. We're in the middle of a mental health, and it's above a crisis. We're being told that the next pandemic, and the pandemic right now that would be in the epidemic category, so we got epidemic, which is a whole lot of people, and we got pandemic, which saying it's kind of everywhere and everyone, is that of a mental health crisis. When we see the depression numbers, anxiety disorder numbers as high as we're seeing, we see addiction rates of all types, from digital addiction to alcohol. The Alcohol Beverage Association tells us that over an 8-week period, they sold $8 billion, $1 billion a week over 8 weeks of alcohol. How do you even, in a week's time, you sold $1 billion and you made a record of sales of about $8 billion over 8 weeks? So that's what's happening when we see depression rates go up, we see anxiety rates go up, we'll see addiction. And that's just alcohol. We know cannabis, we know food addiction, we can put that in there, prescription drug usage certainly can be there. I'll say digital can be gaming. We know since the pandemic, about 2.5, 3 years, we've seen the use of video games skyrocket. It's doubled for our kids in particular. Most of the research says at least it's doubled by 50%, but kids are spending more time than ever imaginable on video games. So we have a teen mental health epidemic that's moving itself along to become pandemic. What does that look like? Here's the things that we're looking for. The why. We have more lonely kids than ever before. Loneliness. We've got confusion. There seems to be so much confusion on what to believe, what's correct, and related to that is gender messages that are creating confusion. We didn't see this even just a few years ago, but the messaging is strong, and so the confusion is strong as it relates to about anything related to gender. We know that there's brain issues. We've, through technology, through overuse of technology, through online school that didn't work because we had the highest academic failure ever in year 2021. What we know is that digitizing the brain, so to speak, overuse of technology on a developing brain creates an addictive brain, creates a craving brain. It creates a brain that wants more and more and more stimuli. That's one. And then we also, with our kids, have something called neurotoxins. We're looking at toxicities, be it byproducts of plastics, things that are put into our food. There's an increase in neurotoxins, and in other words, toxicity levels to the brain that researchers are saying this is doing something, these toxicities. So here's the few of the issues. We look at why do we have kids, and you think about critical ages 12 to 17. Why would that be across our country that suicide is the second leading cause of death of that age group? How could that be? And there are certain counties, and we've looked at certain counties, that suicide has been the number one cause of death in that age group. Number one, 12 to 17-year-olds. All right. Well, other things we need to mention of what's happening is attention hyperactivity disorder with kids is also something that we're seeing more and more diagnosis for autism on the autism spectrum. This is everything from social cues to total mind absorption, to ability to not handle outside stimuli, just normal developmental. And when we use the term autism, we're looking at this on a continuum that goes from mild to stronger symptoms. We know that there are, and the best way to put this, and I pulled this out of the research, is there's overlapping influences that are causing fluctuations in the serotonin levels. So we got serotonin in our brain. It's super important. Dopamine, these two brain neurotransmitters. Serotonin, a lot to do with mood, a lot to do with sleep, a lot to do with appetite. All these things are being affected for our kids. And the dopamine levels, which is our feel-good chemical, we get that a lot of times from our exercise and so forth. Well, with kids, we're seeing great fluctuations in the serotonin level, which again controls a lot to do with mood. There's another very fascinating brain chemical I just want to put out right now, and that's GABA, G-A-B-A. And it's actually an amino acid that's transferred and made into a brain neurotransmitter. Think of it this way. It's the brakes on the brain. It helps stop impulsive behavior, acting out behavior. It's a brain brake. And the GABA levels, and some of the research is saying these are off for our kids for whatever reason. All right. We know that if there's which is brain, inflammation, research is suggesting there's a higher level of risk for suicide. Brain inflammation. Again, I'm still on the age group, approximately 12 to 19. We're seeing that it's particularly zeroed in on those 12 to about 17. So anytime we have brain inflammation, things that would be autoimmune disorders and disease process for our young generation, we start to see these are influencing factors that can promote the direction of suicide or suicide ideation, thinking about it. We know that there is an enormous amount of activity going on in the social media world as it relates to our kids. And when I say social media, this is everything from TikTok to texting to kids aren't really into Facebook anymore, but everything going out there, because kids run in herds. For a while, Snapchat was cool and everybody was on Snapchat, and then it moves over to another app, etc. So they kind of run in large groups. This said, we know that the cyber bully behavior, sex texting, all these are factors for our kids that they're being bombarded with. It's nearly impossible to measure cyber bully behavior, but this is online threats. This is it's an emotional abuse. It could lead to physical intimidation. But what does cyber bully behavior do to kids over time? How does that affect the brain? How does that affect the self-esteem? Our sense of value gets diminished. And somebody says online, why don't you just kill yourself? And it's difficult to report, but there are kids who have been bullied online and threatened. And that statement's been made, and that's what the kids have done. They've taken their life. Wow. By the way, if you're a parent, and I realize that this is a difficult podcast, difficult information, one that most of us need to have at least an awareness of what's going on. But there's something I call caregiver stress. I made a few notes that, if you're living with somebody, youth or adult, and there's been suicide attempts, suicide ideation, suicide language, great depths of despair, depression, you may find that this is like, it is so draining. And I wrote down, you may feel overwhelmed. You're obviously constantly worried, which means you're hyper vigilant to everything. You're always on edge. You're probably not sleeping well, not enough sleep. You may feel just an overall sense of, besides being overwhelmed, just that sadness. And I want to acknowledge that, because if you're a professional, a counselor, a loved one, carrying these burdens, it really does represent significant chronic stress. And you live in a habitual state of, what else should I be doing? What do I need to be doing? Because you feel like you have to save this person's life, make sure they don't take their life. How does a person get to that point of taking their life? Well, one of the things is they get into a mentality that there is no way out. It is so overwhelming, and it's so staggering in a person's life. It's just that push into a downward spiral of darkness. That two things. Person says, I feel like there's no way out, and there is no hope left. Hope is gone. And that's the sense that they feel. Now, well, what else is going on? Well, we know that generally speaking, there's very high anxiety. That chronic anxiety could be present, could have been present for a long time. Through the pandemic, I'm calling it the anxiety virus. People have developed a pattern of fear in their life. It's as though fear's got a stronghold in their life. And we know that this anxiety is very real. It's very real in the effects it has on the body. We know that for a person to be considering suicide, or even have those kinds of thoughts or planning in their life, depression is pretty significant. And you hear the term clinical depression. It is a deep depression that does not lift. Maybe they've tried a lot of different, maybe counseling, different tools. I know people who have done all the things you hear advertised for depression. And there's a lot of things being advertised right now. They've done it all. And because there's a desperation, and they feel like, I've done it all, and the depression's still there. I've tried every medication. I've done all the different unique therapies. I've tried brain stimulation. I've done it all, and nothing's working. And that's where they get to the places, there's no way out, and there's no hope left, because I've done it all. And that's a sense that oftentimes a person who is suicidal have arrived at that. And we know that they may feel very, very disconnected from others. They may spend a lot of time online, but feel more lonely than ever. They may have a sense, I wrote down the word false intimacy, that they thought they were close to certain people online. You meet somebody online, you go, oh, wow, they're my friend. And you feel an instant bonding, but it's a false intimacy. I have all these friends online, but they're not friends. All right, cyberbullying behavior could really be significant. This could everything from name calling to sexual oriented texting. We have been involved here at the Center, a Place of Hope, with situations where inappropriate pictures have been shared or sent out. And then we had a situation where a college student had taken some inappropriate pictures, sent those to, in this case, it was a boyfriend. Things didn't go so well in the relationship. He says, "I'm going to get you," and he sends out sexually oriented photographs to a very large group of college students. And she, the victim of this, took her life. So these are the kinds of things that are happening that we're seeing. What are the common threads? And today, as difficult as this topic is, we do need to talk about it, because I really believe, and I wrote it in the book here, there is so much to live for, but if you're at a place of no options, no way out, no hope, there is no way that you see that. And I also believe that. I also know that's true. We know that there is that sense of hopelessness as a common thread. There's the feeling of being trapped. In other words, no way out. There is a sense of a despairing isolation. I am so disconnected, so isolated. And that disconnect that with other people, that you feel not only totally alone, you feel so isolated that it's unbearable, which leads us finally to the despair, the sense of that great despair. If I have despair, I develop despondency, and despondency brings me to that place of irrational thinking. I begin to make and think about decisions that I normally would not. So we do know that, and this is some of the research, and today I'm just going to share just a little bit more information as it relates to research. But when there's been death by suicide, we know that at the top of the list of concerns were relationship issues. Relationship issues. Which could be an abusive relationship, could be failed relationships, but that's at the top of the list. And then also for a person who has had death by suicide, there is a history of some crisis events, and they are typically afraid of the future crisis, that it's unbearable, I can't bear it, and so death by suicide is a way to get out of the next perceived crisis. Substance use is third on the list. Problematic substance use, addiction. Very bottom of the list, it was actually the loss or fear of loss of housing, of where you live. That was like the least of the concerns. Again, relationships, crisis, substance abuse, that was problematic. And a lot of times people say, well, if someone's considering suicide, do they have a mental disorder? And we do know that depression is at the top, followed, depression and anxiety. And number 2 is psychosis. Now, psychosis could be a temporary break from reality, where we become so overwhelmed and our system is so overloaded, we have a temporary break, if you will, from reality. And we can't discern what truth is, and we usually are full of very significant levels of fear. During COVID, we saw emergency rooms begin to, it was a loosely given label, but COVID psychosis, where a person is actually having a break from reality because the COVID fears, the COVID, I've overwhelmed, I've had enough, and it's been a tipping point. A lot of times this was the case for people who had post-traumatic stress disorder, they had trauma in their life, and COVID was like the tipping point that pushed them way over the edge. I am asked, oftentimes, of those who did commit suicide, they're on drugs, alcohol. What we know is approximately, now again, these are approximate numbers, but approximately 40% who were doing suicide attempts. This doesn't mean that they were necessarily successful, but at least 40+% were what we call acute alcohol intoxication. Acute alcohol intoxication. So this is significant in that people usually are chemically altered or in a chemically altered state. There are some deaths that with fentanyl. Fentanyl is a state I live in, 2,000 some deaths, and the news release said, and counting. That's for 1 year. So far. Fentanyl, synthetic painkiller that is highly, highly both addictive and deadly. All right. We haven't mentioned yet military vets and suicide. It was here, we would read about 20 to 22 of our vets were committing suicide a day. And this representative of all conflicts, such as from Vietnam to Afghanistan. We were seeing a Desert Storm, about 22 a day is generally what you would read. That number has gone down, and we're seeing fewer. The delicate age group for those military vets is about 18 to 34 is the age range where we're seeing most of the suicides take place, 18 to 34. All right. Healthcare workers. All right, we're kind of at high risk. Healthcare workers, number one on the list of actual suicides is psychiatrists. And psychiatrists, followed by physicians, followed by dentists. Those that are in the helping professions, psychiatry, physicians, followed by dentists, are at some of the highest health or suicide rates in the healthcare workers. All right, here's a couple myths related to suicide, and I wanted to share these days. Suicide, if you are thinking about taking your life, you had mental illness. That's a myth. Talking about suicide gives an idea. No, talking about suicide and engaging with the person, you may be opening up the window of hope, ultimately, because they're talking about it. And when you say, well, have you ever thought about harming yourself or taking your life? That's not planning an idea. That's actually opening up conversation. A person who's suicidal, they've already thought about all this. You're not giving them any ideas. There's a myth I've heard people say, and I wrote it down. If someone's talking about suicide, they're just looking for attention. Not the case at all. Some of these just show how disconnected we are from a person's struggles. We also know that myth is somebody's, quote, successful, they won't be suicidal, which is interesting. Remember Robin Williams, designer Kate Spade. We know that let's see, Naomi Judd. I mean, we can just start naming some that are a little more current, who took their life by suicide, and from all outward appearances, we would put them in, quote, the successful category. How do you help somebody? And this is where we'll wrap up today. Be willing to talk to them. Trust yourself. You may have a sense in your gut that something's amiss. I do hear people go, I wish I would have said something. I wish I would have talked to them. So move from, excuse me, move from regret into a sense of, I'm going to say something. We also know that we cannot control another person. People who have made a decision for suicide sometimes will come across as relieved. They start to put everything in order. And you go, wow, they're better. And they have a sense of being better because they made a decision. When you get to the place that you cannot see there's a reason to live, you've passed into a zone of irrational thinking and disconnection from reality. There is a definite descent into darkness. Here's the things to be aware of. Disappointment, ongoing disappointment. Number 2, ongoing discouragement. Number 3, a person that feels demoralized. I have no value, no reason to live. And then finally, they feel dismissed. They are so dismissed by those that they would want to have for their loved ones, that they have a sense that I have no value, I have no meaning, and there is no hope. So what do we do here? We've got to ultimately come back to a place where I've revived my sense of purpose. Many times this is a slow process that a person can move slowly through a healing, whether it's traumatic past, whether there's been addiction. But we need to look at, my belief, in a spiritual sense, there is a real darkness that comes over a person that's all about self-destruction. And sometimes we need help to break out of that darkness and that stronghold that can really speak against life. And so we don't want to handle suicide situations alone. We want to help our loved ones, but we also want to be at a place where we know that there needs to be help beyond us. I pray for a person's protection. I pray that there is a pause so that we can get help. And the prayer of protection means I pray that their life will be preserved and they will prevail and have victory over the issues that have pushed them to this point. All right. I personally believe there is hope and that people do recover from a lifelong pattern of even suicide, darkness, stronghold in their life. And I believe in the power of recovered joy. All right, there's so much more in the book, so much to live for as it relates to the suicide topic. And I just want to acknowledge a very difficult topic. If you've had a loved one that has taken their life, or a friend, the ripple effect of suicide and what that does in our lives is very significant. And we oftentimes need to receive some help in our own life, because we can do blame and go, what if I would have, and get into self-blame. And so often loved ones maybe feel like, well, I'm just going to take my life too. And so it takes you down this pattern of lies, and we need to speak truth. And hope comes when there's a plan. And at times we need to have a plan for life. And there is life. And there is hope.